The rain poured down in heavy sheets as she pulled her coat tighter around herself, staring up at the towering glass building in front of her. It was sleek, modern, and intimidating, everything she imagined a billionaire's empire would look like. She swallowed hard, nerves twisting in her stomach. This was it. The job interview that could change everything she had spent weeks searching, applying for anything that could pay the bills. And then, almost by chance, she had stumbled upon the listing an assistant position for one of the most powerful businessmen in the city. She had hesitated before sending in her application, convinced she didn't stand a chance. But the call had come faster than she expected, and now, here she was, standing in front of a place where she clearly didn't belong. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The lobby was grand, with high ceilings and marble floors that gleamed under soft lighting. People in tailored suits moved with purpose, their conversations clipped and professional. She felt small, out of place, but she forced herself to keep walking toward the reception desk. The woman behind the desk barely looked up as she checked the schedule. "You're here for the interview," she nodded quickly. "Take the elevator to the top floor," the woman instructed. "He's expecting you," her heart pounded as she stepped into the elevator, watching the numbers climb higher and higher. When the doors finally opened, she found herself in a space that was impossibly elegant, yet minimal floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city, sleek furniture, and bookshelves filled with business journals and awards. And then she saw him. He stood behind a massive desk, phone in hand, deep in conversation. Even from across the room, his presence was undeniable. Sharp features, an air of control, and the kind of confidence that only came from knowing the world bent to his will. She had seen pictures of him before, his name in articles about wealth and power, but nothing had prepared her for the real thing. When he finally ended his call and looked at her, there was a brief moment of silence. His gaze was unreadable, assessing. Then he gestured for her to sit. "You're here for the assistant position," he said. She nodded. "Yes." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Your sum is unexpected. You don't have experience in corporate environments. What made you apply?" She hesitated. "I needed a job. And I learned fast." Something flickered in his eyes, but it was gone before she could place it. "I don't have time for mistakes," he said bluntly. "This job requires more than just learning fast. You'll need to anticipate problems before they happen, keep up with an impossible schedule, and handle pressure without breaking." She straightened in her seat. "I can do that for a moment." He didn't respond. Then, without looking away, he pressed a button on his desk. "Start her paperwork." She blinked. "Wait, you're hiring me unless you're having second thoughts," he said. She shook her head quickly. "No, I mean thank you. I won't let you down." His expression remained unreadable. "We'll see." She left his office in a daze. She had the job. She should have been relieved, excited even. But instead, something about the way he had looked at her stayed in her mind. There was something in his eyes, something guarded, something unreadable. She had no idea that walking into that office would change her life in ways she couldn't imagine. And she certainly never expected that, behind the cold, untouchable exterior of the billionaire, there was a man capable of having his heart stolen. She spent her first few days in the office, learning the ropes, and it didn't take long for her to realize just how demanding the job was. The billionaire wasn't just strict, he expected perfection. He didn't repeat himself, didn't tolerate delays, and certainly didn't believe in second chances. She watched the way the office moved around him, how people snapped to attention when he entered a room, how meetings were run with precision, and how his schedule was managed down to the second. He worked at a pace that seemed almost impossible, yet he never looked overwhelmed. Instead, he carried himself with an air of control that made it clear he was always a step ahead of everyone else. At first, she thought he barely noticed her. He gave instructions without looking up from his screen, handed her documents to file without explanation, and dismissed her the second a task was complete. But then, little things started to change one afternoon. She made a mistake in email sent to the wrong department. It wasn't major, but in this company, every detail mattered. She braced herself for the cold disappointment she had come to expect. Instead, he only glanced at her. "Fix it." He said simply, "She did." And when she checked again, she realized he had subtly corrected something else in the email. Something she hadn't even noticed was wrong. She started paying closer attention. He never outright explained things, but the way he worked, the way he moved through deals and negotiations, was a lesson in itself. He wasn't just powerful because of his wealth. He was powerful because he understood people. But what fascinated her the most was that, despite his cold and distant demeanor, there were moments, just fleeting moments, where she caught a glimpse of something else. Like the way his gaze lingered on the city skyline late at night, as if lost in thought. Or the way he ran a hand through his hair when he was frustrated, a tiny crack in his otherwise controlled exterior. And then there were the rare moments when their eyes met across the room, and she felt something she couldn't quite explain. She told herself it was nothing. Just her imagination. Until the night everything changed. It had been an impossibly long day, and most of the office had already gone home. She was finishing up the last of her notes when she heard footsteps behind her. "You're still here," his voice said from the doorway. She turned, startled. He was standing there, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, looking more exhausted than she'd ever seen him. "I had a few things left to do," she said. He studied her for a moment before stepping inside. "You work harder than most people here." She blinked. "I have to keep up." Something in his expression shifted, just for a second. Then he nodded. "Good." She expected him to leave after that, but he didn't. Instead, he walked over to his desk and sat down, rubbing his temples. For the first time since she had started, he looked human. Without thinking, she spoke. "Rough day." He exhaled a quiet laugh, surprising her. You could say that she hesitated before stepping closer. "Is there anything I can do to help?" He looked at her then, really looked at her. And for a moment, the air between them felt different, charged with something unspoken. Then, just as quickly, the moment passed. He shook his head and leaned back. "No, you should go home." She nodded, but as she left the office that night, one thought lingered in her mind. For all his power, for all his control, he was lonely. And she wasn't sure why, but that realization stayed with her long after she walked away. The days that followed blurred into a whirlwind of work, late nights, and stolen glances she wasn't sure she imagined. The billionaire remained as demanding as ever, his expectations razor sharp, but there was something different now. He wasn't just watching her work, he was watching her. It was subtle. The way he noticed when she was tired. The way he listened a second longer when she spoke. The way his expression softened, just barely, when she found a way to fix a problem, before he even had to mention it. She wasn't sure what to make of it. He was still impossible to read, still as guarded as ever, but there were cracks in the walls he had built. And for some reason, she couldn't stop wondering what was behind them. One evening, as she was organizing his schedule for the following week, she overheard a conversation she wasn't supposed to. His office door was slightly open, and his voice, low and controlled, carried into the hallway. "You know I don't have time for distractions," he said, irritation laced in his tone. The person on the other end, she couldn't tell if it was a business associate or someone else, responded in a way that made him sigh. "That's not the issue," he said. "It's not that simple." A long pause. Then, in a voice quieter than before, he added, "I can't afford to make mistakes." She stepped away before she could hear more, heart racing. Mistakes? The billionaire didn't make mistakes. At least, that's what everyone believed, but something about the way he said it told her that wasn't true. The next day, a complication arose in a major deal he had been working on for weeks. The negotiations had been progressing smoothly until now. She watched as the tension in his posture tightened, the usual sharpness in his gaze, turning cold by the time the meeting ended. It was clear something had gone wrong. The investors were no longer confident, and a deadline was closing in fast. The billionaire barely acknowledged anyone as he strode back to his office, his movements precise, controlled, but there was a storm beneath the surface. She hesitated for only a second before following him. "You shouldn't be in here right now," he said the moment she stepped inside, his voice edged with frustration. "I know," she said, closing the door behind her. "But I think you need someone who's not afraid to tell you that you don't have to handle everything alone." His jaw tightened. "That's exactly why I do it alone." Because relying on people, he stopped himself, exhaling sharply. It doesn't always end well. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Then, against all logic, she said, "I think you trust people more than you let on." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "And why would you think that? Because if you didn't, you wouldn't be this angry right now. You wouldn't care." Something shifted in his gaze, something vulnerable, something she had never seen before. But just as quickly, it was gone. "You should go," he said, his voice quieter. This time she wanted to argue, to push, but she didn't. Instead, she nodded and left. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that she was getting closer to something buried deep within him, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she wasn't sure if she wanted to stop. The atmosphere in the office had changed. The tension surrounding the billionaire was heavier than ever, an invisible weight pressing down on everyone. The deal that had once seemed like a sure success was now slipping through his fingers, and she could see how much it was affecting him. He had always been composed, always in control, but now there were moments when she caught the flicker of something else, something dangerously close to frustration. She wanted to help, but he had closed himself off again, retreating into his world of numbers, contracts, and late-night meetings. He barely spoke to her unless it was about work, and when he did, his words were clipped, distant. It was as if he had drawn an invisible line between them, one she wasn't meant to cross. But then, one evening, everything shifted. She had stayed late to finish organizing documents for a last-minute investor call when she heard a crash from his office. Alarmed, she rushed to the doorway and found him standing by his desk, his back to her, his hands gripping the edge so tightly, his knuckles turned white. A shattered glass lay on the floor beside him, water spreading across the polished surface. "Are you okay?" she asked cautiously. He didn't turn around. "Go home," she hesitated. "Not until you tell me what's wrong." A sharp, humorless laugh escaped him. "Everything is wrong." He finally turned to face her, his usually guarded expression raw with frustration. "The deal is falling apart. I've spent years building this, and now it could all be taken away because someone decided I wasn't worth the risk." She had never seen him like this before, not just angry, but vulnerable. And in that moment, she realized something. It wasn't just about the deal. It was about proving something to the investors, to the world, but most of all to himself. "That's not true," she said. "You built this company from nothing. You don't need their approval to prove your worth." His eyes locked onto hers, something unreadable flashing across his face. "And what if I lose everything?" She stepped closer, her voice steady. "Then you build it again. Because that's who you are." For a long moment, he just stared at her. Then, with a quiet exhale, he ran a hand through his hair, some of the tension in his shoulders easing. "You always know exactly what to say, don't you?" She smiled faintly. "Not always. But I know when someone needs to hear the truth." Something in the air between them shifted. The distance he had been keeping between them, the wall he had so carefully built, was cracking. And for the first time, she saw not the billionaire, not the powerful man everyone feared, but just him, flawed, uncertain, human. But before either of them could say anything more, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. "They're making their final decision tomorrow," he said, mostly to himself tomorrow. That was it. Everything was riding on one final meeting as she left his office that night. Her heart pounded with something she couldn't quite name. Because for the first time since she had started working for him, she wasn't just afraid of what would happen to the company. She was afraid of what would happen to him. The next morning, the entire office felt like it was holding its breath. The meeting that would determine everything was just hours away, and the billionaire had locked himself in his office, preparing for what could either be his greatest victory or his most devastating loss. She tried to focus on her tasks, but the weight of uncertainty pressed down on her. She had seen him handle pressure before, but this was different. There was too much at stake, too much on the line. And for the first time, she wondered if even he wasn't sure how this would end then. Just as she was about to take him a final report, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something told her to answer. A sharp voice came through the line. "If you care about him, you'll convince him to walk away." Her heart stopped. "Who is this?" "You don't need to know that," the voice said. "Just understand that if he goes into that meeting today, he won't come out the same. Some people don't like what he's trying to do, and they'll make sure he pays for it." The line went dead before she could say another word. She stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear, her mind racing. Who would do this? Who would threaten him like this? She rushed to his office, barely thinking, barely breathing. When she burst through the door, he looked up, startled. "You need to cancel the meeting," she said, her voice urgent. His brows furrowed. "What are you talking about?" "Someone just called me. They don't want you to go through with this deal. They said." She swallowed hard. "They said you'd regret it if you did." For a moment he said nothing. Then, instead of fear, a slow, knowing look crossed his face. "So they finally decided to show their hand." Her stomach dropped. "You knew?" "I suspected," he admitted. "There have been complications behind the scenes. People who don't like change. People who want things to stay exactly as they are." He exhaled. "I just didn't think they'd try to involve you." Her chest tightened. "This isn't just about business, is it?" He hesitated. "No," he said finally. "It never was." She stared at him, realization dawning. "Then what is it about?" But before he could answer, his phone rang. Another call. Another moment that could change everything. And as he reached for it, she had the sinking feeling that nothing in their world would ever be the same again. He answered the call, his expression unreadable as he listened. She watched him closely, trying to decipher anything from his face, but he was completely still. Then, after a long pause, he simply said, "I understand." And just like that, the call ended. She couldn't take it anymore. What did they say? His jaw clenched, but his voice was calm. "They gave me one last warning. Back out, or face the consequences." Her heart pounded. "And what are you going to do?" He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw something new in his eyes, not just determination, but something deeper, something unshakable. "I'm going to that meeting." Fear tightened in her chest. "But what if?" "I can't run from this," he interrupted. "If I do, they win. And I won't let that happen." She could see there was no changing his mind. He had already made his decision. And as much as she wanted to protect him, she knew this was something he had to face. The meeting was held in the grand conference room, a space lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. The investors were already seated, their expressions unreadable as they waited for him to make his case. But there was a different energy in the air, one of quiet tension, of unseen forces shifting just beneath the surface. She sat in the back, watching as he stepped forward, commanding the room with his presence. He laid out his vision, his plans, his reasons why this deal wasn't just important, it was necessary. His words were powerful, each one carrying weight, each argument carefully constructed. But just as the meeting was reaching its peak, a sudden interruption shattered the moment. The doors swung open, and a man in a dark suit walked in, his presence sending a ripple of unease through the room. She recognized him instantly, one of the most powerful and ruthless businessmen in the industry. Someone who thrived in the shadows, pulling strings where no one could see. "Forgive the intrusion," he said smoothly, his voice dripping with false politeness. "But I thought it was time I joined the conversation." A heavy silence fell. She could see the tension in his posture, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides. "What do you want?" the billionaire asked, his voice cold. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "To offer you a choice. Walk away from this deal, and everything stays as it is. You keep your company, your success, your power." His gaze darkened. "But if you continue down this path, I can't promise things will remain so comfortable." The room was deathly still. She could see the way he weighed the words, the way he considered every possible outcome in mere seconds. Then, finally, he straightened, his voice steady. "I don't make decisions based on threats," he said. "And I don't take orders from men like you." The man's expression flickered just slightly before he let out a quiet laugh. "Brave," he mused, "but foolish." Without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving behind a room full of stunned investors. The weight of what had just happened hung over them, thick and suffocating. But then, slowly, one of the investors spoke. "If he's that desperate to stop this deal," he said, "then maybe it means you're onto something big." A murmur of agreement followed. And in that moment, she knew the tide had turned. By the end of the meeting, the decision was clear. The deal was moving forward. Despite the threats, despite the risks, he had won. But as they left the building, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. And when he turned to her, his expression unreadable, she knew he felt it too. The war wasn't over. It was only just beginning. As they stepped out of the building, the night air felt heavy, charged with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. She glanced at him, searching his face for any sign of relief, but there was none. His jaw was tight, his eyes distant, as if he was already bracing himself for whatever came next. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You did it," she whispered. "They believed in you." His fingers curled around hers, but he still didn't relax. "For now," he murmured, "but this isn't over." And he was right. The threats didn't stop. Subtle at first, deals that mysteriously fell through, meetings that were suddenly rescheduled. Then, more direct. A car that nearly ran them off the road. A break-in at the office, where nothing was stolen, just a warning left behind. She saw the exhaustion creeping into him, the weight of carrying this fight alone. But he never faltered. He faced every challenge head-on, refusing to back down. And she stayed by his side, refusing to let him fight alone. But the real turning point came when an unexpected ally stepped forward. An older businessman, someone she had only seen in passing before, requested a private meeting. He sat across from them in a quiet restaurant, his expression unreadable. "I've watched you for some time now," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And I see something in you that this industry rarely allows honor." The billionaire's gaze remained steady. "That's not always enough," he said. The man nodded. "No, it's not. But sometimes it's exactly what's needed." He leaned forward slightly. "The man you're up against, he's powerful, but he's not untouchable. I have evidence, connections. If you're ready to see this through, I can help." It was a risk, trusting someone new. But they had come too far to back down now. With their new allies' help, the tides began to shift. The threats, the sabotage, it all started to unravel. Whispers turned into reports. Reports turned into headlines. And soon, the empire of the man who had tried to destroy them began to crumble under the weight of its own corruption. And through it all, she saw the billionaire change. He had always been strong, always been determined. But now, he was something more. He had fought for something bigger than himself, and he had won. The final confrontation came in the very office where it all began. The man who had once walked in so confidently, issuing threats with ease, now stood on the other side of the desk, his face pale, his power slipping through his fingers. "You think this changes anything?" he sneered. "There will always be another battle." The billionaire met his gaze, unshaken. "Maybe," he said, "but I've already won this one." And just like that, it was over. In the weeks that followed, things slowly returned to normal, or at least a new kind of normal. The company thrived under his leadership, stronger than ever. The shadows that had once loomed over them were gone, replaced by something lighter, something hopeful. One evening, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the city, she turned to him and smiled. "So, what's next?" she asked. He looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, he truly smiled. "A future," he said. "Our future." And with that, the fight was behind them. The battles, the fear, the uncertainty, it had all led them here. To this moment. To each other. And that was enough.